The war had been going on for 6 years. 6 years of burning ships. 6 years of dead soldiers floating in the cold dark between stars. 6 years of humans and the CS Empire, throwing everything they had at each other, and neither side winning. That was the problem. The CS had fought many species before humanity. They had crushed every single one of them. Some fell in months, some lasted a few years, but they all fell. The costs were bigger, older, and stronger than almost every civilization in the known galaxy. Their ships were massive. Their soldiers stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in thick natural armor made of dark chitin, a biological shell harder than most metals. They did not feel pain the way softer creatures did. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. When they first found the humans, they expected the same result. They were wrong. Humans were small, soft, slow compared to a cause soldier. They had no natural armor, no claws, no biological weapons. On paper, they should have been easy. On paper, the war should have been over in a year. But humans did something the Cost had never seen before. They adapted. Every time the Cost used a new weapon, humans studied it, broke it apart, and built their own version within months. Every time the Cost changed tactics, humans changed faster. Every time a human base was destroyed, 3 more appeared somewhere else. The humans did not fight the way the Cost expected. They were unpredictable. They hid from strange angles. They made no sense, and they kept smiling during negotiations. That part disturbed the Cost more than anything else. By the 6th year, both sides had lost too much. The CS High Council looked at their numbers and saw a war that could last another 20 years. And at the end of it, even if they won, there would be almost nothing left of their empire. On the human side, entire colonies had been wiped out. Billions were dead. Earth's government looked at the same numbers and reached the same conclusion. Someone had to talk. Every human diplomat who had tried before had been returned in pieces. Sometimes the pieces were in a box. Sometimes they were not even in the right order. The Cost did not believe in diplomacy. They believed in dominance. You submitted or you were destroyed. There was no middle ground in their culture. So when Earth sent Commander Ethan Voss alone on a single small shuttle with no weapons, no escort, and no backup, most people thought it was a death sentence. Ethan did not think so. Or if he did not show it. He was not a large man. He was average in almost every way that mattered physically. Medium height, lean build, short dark hair going slightly gray in the sides. He had spent 12 years as a soldier before moving into the diplomatic corps, and the soldier part of him had never really left. He moved quietly. He observed everything. He never raised his voice. When his shuttle docked with the CS Imperial warship, known as the Eternal Sovereignty, the docking bay alone was large enough to fit most human buildings inside it. The ceiling stretched so far above him that it disappeared into shadow. Sea soldiers lined both walls, enormous, armored, perfectly still. Their eyes were compound like insects, and they reflected the cold light of the bay in dozens of tiny fragments. None of them moved as Ethan walked through. A younger man might have slowed down, might have looked up at the soldiers, and felt the weight of how small he was. Ethan walked at the same pace he always walked, like a man who had somewhere to be, and was not in a particular hurry to get there. The CS escort led him through long corridors of dark metal. The ship smelled of something sharp and mineral, like iron heated on a fire. Every surface was angular, built for creatures much larger than him. The doorways were twice his height. The furniture, where he passed any, looked like it had been carved from stone. He was brought to the throne hall. It was enormous. The floor was polished black, so clean it reflected everything above it like still water. The ceiling was veined and carved with thousands of names. CS victories he assumed etched in their angular script. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a wide platform of dark stone, sat the throne, and on the throne sat Queen Valeth Dras. She was the largest Cass he had ever seen, and he had seen many. Her chitin was nearly black, with a deep blue sheen that caught the light when she moved. Her crown was not gold or jeweled like a human monarch might wear. It was made of bone, real bone taken from defeated enemies, shaped into sharp points that rose above her head like a dark halo. Her compound eyes were amber, and they fixed on Ethan the moment he entered the hall. The court was packed. Hundreds of CS nobles, military officers, and advisors stood along the walls watching. Some of them made sounds, low clicking noises in the back of their throats. Ethan had been told by his briefing team that this was the cause equivalent of laughter. He stopped at the center of the hall, exactly where the escort had halted. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, slowly, calmly, making sure every soldier in the room could see the movement clearly, and took out a small data chip. It was a standard human data chip, no larger than his thumbnail. He placed it on the floor. Then he slid it forward with the toe of his boot, gently across the polished black floor, until it came to rest about 10 feet in front of the throne platform. The clicking sound stopped. The hall went completely quiet. Ethan straightened up and waited. One of the Queen's advisors, a tall Sea in dark ceremonial armor, stepped down from the platform, picked up the chip and carried it to the Queen. Valith held it between two fingers and looked at it. Then she looked at Ethan. He met her gaze without blinking. The chip contained a single file, a full projection, numbers, maps, timelines showing exactly what the next 10 years of war would cost both sides. Not just the military cost, everything, resources, population decline, infrastructure, generational damage. It was thorough, precise, and completely honest. It did not favor humanity. It did not flatter the cost. It simply showed the math. Valif stared at him for a long time. Long enough that some of the soldiers near Ethan shifted their weight, waiting for the order. No order came. Finally, the Queen spoke. Her voice was deep and measured, translated into his earpiece by Liaison Senna standing somewhere behind him. "You came alone?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Why?" He thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Because if I had brought soldiers, you would have seen a threat. I needed you to see something else." Another silence. Then Valith leaned back in her throne just slightly. "And what is it you needed me to see, Herman?" "A conversation worth having," he said. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said something to her court that made every cost in the room go still. She said, "Leave us." The court obeyed. That surprised Ethan more than anything else that had happened so far. He had expected resistance, some senior officer stepping forward, some advisor protesting. But when the Queen spoke, the hall emptied without a single word of argument. Hundreds of cost nobles and soldiers filed out through the side corridors in complete silence. Even the guards at the doors stepped outside and pulled the massive panels shut behind them. The sound of the doors closing echoed through the empty hall like a slow thunderclap. Then there was nothing, just the two of them in a room large enough to land a ship in. Veal stood from her throne. Even at a distance, the movement was striking. She was not slow or stiff the way something her size might have been expected to be. She moved like everything she did was deliberate. Every step measured, every shift of weight controlled. She descended the platform steps and stopped at the edge of it, looking down at him from the elevated stone. "Sit," she said. "I'm fine standing," Ethan replied. There was a pause. The amber eyes studied him. "That was not a polite offer," she said. "I understood that," he said. "I'm still fine standing." Another pause. Then the Queen stepped down from the platform entirely and walked toward him. She stopped about 4 feet away. Up close, she was even more imposing. The dark chiton across her shoulders and chest was layered like plates, each one overlapping the next. There were old marks on it, scratches and stress lines, the kind that came from real combat, not ceremony. This was not a queen who had only ever sat on a throne. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand and cannot quite manage. "You are not afraid," she said. It was not a compliment. It sounded more like an observation she found irritating. "I've been afraid before," Ethan said. It didn't help much. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and walked slowly to one side of the hall. He turned with her, keeping her in view. She moved as though she was thinking out loud with her feet. "The data you brought," she said. "My advisors will say it is fabricated, that the numbers are designed to frighten us into stopping a war we are winning." "Are you winning?" Ethan asked. She stopped walking. "Be careful," she said low and even. "I'm not trying to be rude," he said. "I'm asking a real question. By what measure are you winning? Territory. You've taken colonies?" "Yes. We've taken them back or made them expensive enough that holding them costs more than they're worth. Ships. You've destroyed hundreds of ours. We've destroyed hundreds of yours. Time." He let that sit for a second. Time is the one thing neither of us has in our favor. Vale turned to face him again. The amber eyes had changed. Not softer, but sharper, more focused. "You speak like someone who has already decided the outcome," she said. "No," he said. "I speak like someone who has read the data." That night, he was given quarters aboard the ship, a small room by cost standards. which meant it was roughly the size of a large apartment by human ones. The bed was designed for a cost body and was essentially a wide, flat slab of dense material. He slept on it anyway, using his jacket as a pillow, and slept better than he had in weeks. The negotiations began the next morning. They did not go well. Admiral Ref was present from the first session. He was Valith's senior military commander, and from the moment he entered the room, Ethan understood that this was a man who had no interest in peace. Wrath was older than most Cass. His chiton was a faded gray-black, worn at the edges. He had fought humans for most of his career. He hated them with the clean, organized hatred of someone who had turned it into a professional habit. Every time Ethan made a point, Wrath reframed it as weakness. Every time Ethan offered a concession, Wrath told the court it was proof that humanity was desperate. When Ethan presented a proposed ceasefire boundary, WH spent 40 minutes explaining why accepting any boundary not drawn by K's victory would be an insult to every soldier who had ever died in the Empire service. The High Council watched from their seats along the wall and said almost nothing. They were waiting to see which way the wind blew. By the third day, nothing had moved. Ethan returned to his quarters each night and sat in the silence of the enormous room and went over everything again in his head. Every word Ref had said, every reaction from the council, every small shift in Vale's expression during the sessions, he was looking for the edge, the place where something could move. He had not found it yet. On the third night, he was not sleeping. He was sitting on the edge of the stone slab with a small handheld screen reading through K's legal texts that Senna had quietly provided him. Old ones centuries deep. When he heard the door open, he looked up. Vale stood in the doorway. She was not in her full ceremonial armor. She wore something darker, simpler, still structured, still imposing, but without the crown and the layered formal plating. She looked, if anything, more dangerous this way, less like a symbol and more like what she actually was. The door closed behind her. Ethan set down the screen and stood, not out of fear, out of basic courtesy. She crossed the room in a few long strides. He did not move back. There was nowhere to move back to. The wall was already behind him, and he had not realized how close he had been standing to it. In 2 more steps, she was directly in front of him, and then her hand came up fast, controlled, and pressed flat against the wall beside his head. Not a strike, a pin. The other hand came to his collar, not gripping, but present, a statement. He was not going anywhere. She was close enough that he could see the individual plates of her chiton, the faint light catching blue beneath the black. Her amber eyes were level with the top of his head. She looked down at him from that small height difference, the way a mountain looks down at the things standing at its base. Reth will never let these talks succeed. Her voice was quieter than it was in the hall. Stripped of the performance, the council will follow him before they follow uncertainty. And a human asking for peace looks like uncertainty to every cause who has ever been taught that peace is what you offer the defeated. Ethan said nothing. He was listening. There is one law in this empire, older than the council, she said, older than the military, older than the war codes and the fleet protocols and every treaty ever written. She paused. Royal bond law. A contract made under royal bond cannot be challenged by the council, cannot be overturned by an admiral, cannot be undone by anyone who does not hold the throne. She paused. You want peace, human? She said. Not a question, a statement with a door in it. Yes, he said, her eyes held his. Then marry me. The room was absolutely silent. Somewhere deep in the ship, something mechanical hummed faintly. That was the only sound. Ethan did not move, did not blink, did not look away from her eyes. He thought about 6 years of war, about burning ships and dead soldiers, about the math on that data chip, and what it looked like 10 years from now if nothing changed. He thought about what she had just offered him. A trap, a leash, a political cage dressed up in the language of solution. He thought about all of it for exactly 15 seconds. Then he said quietly and without any particular drama, I'll need to think about it. You have until morning. Valith stared at him. She released his collar, stepped back. The hand came away from the wall. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since he had boarded her ship. She looked like something had genuinely surprised her. She turned and walked to the door, stopped with her hand on it. Morning, she said, then she left. Ethan stood alone in the quiet room, his back against the cold metal wall, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he sat down, picked up the screen, and got to work. Ethan did not sleep that night. He did not pace either. He did not sit in the corner and stare at the wall or talk to himself or do any of the things a man in his position might reasonably be expected to do. He sat cross-legged in the center of the wide stone slab, the small handheld screen balanced on his knee, and he worked. The first thing he did was read. Not news, not messages from Earth. He had not contacted Earth since boarding the ship, and he did not intend to. Now, there was nothing they could tell him that would help. And everything he told them would only create noise, committees forming, generals arguing, politicians asking questions that would take weeks to answer. He had no weeks. He had until morning, so he read Cost Law. Senna had given him 3 volumes of translated legal texts, old ones, pulled from the Imperial Archive. Most diplomats would have skimmed them for the obvious things. Ceasefire clauses, standard treaty language. Ethan had read every page of all 3 twice, starting the night he arrived. He had made notes in the margins using a small stylus. He had circled things that seemed unimportant and underlined things that seemed strange. Now sitting in the dark with the hum of the ship around him, he started pulling those notes together. The Queen was right about one thing. Royal bond law was the oldest legal structure in the Kos Empire. It predated the High Council by nearly 1,000 years. It predated the current military command structure by even longer. When the empire was young and the first Kos sovereigns were consolidating power, they had written a set of laws to protect royal decisions from being undone by political rivals. Those laws had never been removed. They had simply been buried under centuries of newer legislation, forgotten mostly because no one had needed them in a long time. But they were still there and they had gaps in them. Not mistakes exactly, more like places where the people who wrote the laws had simply never imagined a situation like this one. They had written the laws for cost politics, cost culture, cause problems. They had not imagined that one day a human man would be sitting on a warship reading their legal texts by the light of a handheld screen, looking for every loose thread he could find. By the 2nd hour, Ethan had found 11. By the 4th hour, he had turned those 11 threads into 17 specific amendments. Each one was written in careful plain language. Each one used the existing structure of K Royal Bond Law as its foundation, which meant that legally no one could argue the amendments violated imperial tradition because they were built from imperial tradition. They simply extended it in directions no one had thought to go before. Some of the amendments were practical. One established that a royal consort from a non-cost species retained full legal standing to speak on behalf of their people in any imperial proceeding. Another required that any declaration of war involving the consort's home species first passed through a review process that included the consort's formal testimony. A third created a legal definition of mutual sovereignty that had never existed in cost law before. The idea that 2 civilizations could be bound by treaty as equals rather than as conqueror and conquered. That one had taken him the longest to write. He had rewritten it 6 times before he was satisfied. He thought about Earth while he worked, not in a sentimental way. He was not the kind of man who got sentimental easily, but he thought about a specific moment years ago early in the war, before he had moved to the diplomatic corps. He had been on a colony ship during an evacuation. The cost had been closing in, and there had not been enough room for everyone. He remembered standing in a corridor while the ship's captain made decisions no one should ever have to make. He remembered the faces of the people who did not make it onto the ship. He had carried that memory a long time. Not as grief exactly, more as a reminder of what the math actually meant when it stopped being numbers on a screen and became people standing in a corridor. That was why he was here. That was why he had volunteered when no one else would. Not because he wanted to be a hero, because he had seen what happened when nobody tried. The ship's lighting shifted to signal the start of the morning cycle, a slow change from deep blue to a pale amber, the CS equivalent of sunrise. Ethan had 17 amendments, a clean copy of the proposed royal bond contract, as CS law defined it, and a cup of something warm that Senna had quietly left outside his door sometime in the night. It tasted like metal and grass. He drank all of it. He straightened his jacket, picked up the screen, and walked to the throne hall. Valith was already there. She was seated on the throne, back in her full ceremonial armor and crown. The court had not yet been called. The hall was empty except for the Queen and 2 guards at the far doors. She watched him walk the full length of the black floor and stop in the center of the room. "Well," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'll do it." Something shifted in her expression, something more controlled than surprise. She had expected him to come back. He could see that what she had not expected was what came next. "But here are my terms," he said, and held up the screen. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Vale said one word to her guards, and they moved to the side doors and opened them. Within minutes, the court had filed back in. Advisors, nobles, legal scholars, and Admiral Reth, who entered near the back with an expression like he had already decided to be angry about whatever was happening. One of the Queen's legal scholars came forward and took the screen. He read the First Amendment, then the Second. Then he stopped and looked up at Ethan with an expression that was very hard to read. He said something quickly and cost to the Queen. "He says you have used imperial legal language from the Third Dynasty." "Yes," Ethan said. "That code is over 3,000 years old. I know. That's why it works." Another scholar came forward, then another. They clustered around the screen, reading quickly, talking to each other in low, rapid voices. Admiral Reth pushed through to look over their shoulders. His expression moved through several stages. Confusion, then irritation, then something that sat right between fury and disbelief. "This is a trick," Rath said loudly, turning to the court. "This is human manipulation. He has twisted our own law to do what?" Vale's voice cut across the room like something sharp. She was not shouting. She did not need to build a legal structure that serves both sides equally, to create protections that our own law already permits. She looked at Reth with the calm, flat expression of someone who has run out of patience for a particular argument. "Tell me specifically what he has done wrong." Reth opened his mouth, closed it. The hall was silent. Vale looked back at Ethan. She studied him for a long moment, the same way she had looked at him the very first day in this same room, when he had slid a data chip across the floor with his boot. Like something she could not entirely figure out and had decided, against her better judgment, to find interesting. Then she did something that made every C in the room go completely still. She laughed. It was not a polite sound. It was real, low and genuine, and startled out at her like she had not planned it. Her court stared. Several of the advisors exchanged looks. Reth looked like he had been struck. It was, Ethan would later learn from Senna, the first time anyone in the court had heard her laugh in over 3 years. When it faded, Valith looked at him with those sharp amber eyes and said simply, "Begin drafting the formal documents." Ethan nodded once. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He just got back to work. The news spread fast. Within a day of the formal announcement, every corner of the Cass Empire knew that Queen Vale Dracos, sovereign of the oldest and most powerful empire in the known galaxy, had agreed to enter a royal bond with a human. The reaction was not good. On the outer planets, military commanders sent urgent messages to the capital. In the noble houses, old families held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Soldiers who had spent years fighting humans stood in mesh halls and could not find words for what they were feeling. It was not just anger. It was something deeper and more uncomfortable than anger. It was the feeling of a story being rewritten, one they had always believed would end a certain way, suddenly heading somewhere they did not recognize. Admiral Reth moved quickly. He was too experienced to make noise in public. He did not stand in the corridors of the warship and shout. He did not send angry broadcasts. Instead, he went quietly from room to room, speaking to the right people in the right order. The 7 members of the High Council each received a private visit. The senior military governors of 3 outer territories received coded messages. The head of the Imperial Legal Authority, an old CS scholar with deep ties to the traditional noble families, received a long meeting over formal tea. By the 3rd day after the announcement, Reth had built something, not a rebellion. Something cleaner and more dangerous than that, a legal argument. His position was precise. The Queen had been manipulated. Humans were known for psychological complexity. Their diplomats, their negotiators, their entire approach to conflict was built around influencing the thinking of others. It was possible, Rath argued, even likely that Commander Voss had used some form of cognitive or emotional influence to compromise the Queen's judgment. Until that could be disproven, the royal bond contract should be suspended. Ethan should be placed in secured holding for what Reth carefully called a medical and psychological examination. It sounded reasonable. That was the most dangerous thing about it. The High Council voted on the motion 4 days after the announcement. The result was 5-2 in favor of suspension. Ethan was informed by 2 stone-faced coast guards, who appeared at his door early in the morning and told him in flat and polite language that his movement aboard the ship was now restricted and that he was to appear before the council within the hour. He thanked them and asked if he had time to finish his tea. They said no. The council chamber was smaller than the throne hall but no less intimidating. 7 high seats arranged in a curved line, each one occupied by a coslord in formal ceremonial armor. The lighting was low and directed, the kind of lighting designed to make the person standing in the center of the room feel very alone and very visible at the same time. Ethan stood in that center spot with his hands loose at his sides and looked at each council member in turn. Vale was not present. That was deliberate. Under the procedural rules Reth had invoked, the Queen could not be in the room for this particular motion. It was one of the older legal checks in the system, designed originally to prevent a sovereign from intimidating the council into bad decisions. Reth had used it perfectly. The one person who might have stopped this in a single sentence was legally required to be somewhere else. Wrath stood to one side of the chamber, not in a council seat, but close enough to one that his position in the room was clear. The head of the council, an ancient CS whose chiton had faded almost entirely to gray, spoke first. He asked Ethan if he understood the situation. Yes, Ethan said. Do you have anything to say before the council proceeds? Ethan was quiet for a moment, just one moment. Then he said, I'd like to make a presentation. Reth made a short sound somewhere between a click and a word. This is not a negotiation. You are not here to present. He may speak, the head of the council said, flat and final. Even Ref did not argue with that tone. Ethan reached into his jacket and took out the handheld screen. He connected it to the chamber's display system, a simple universal port that every large room on the ship used, and brought up the first file. It was not about the marriage contract or the amendments, or any of the things they expected him to defend. It was a history lesson. He started with the Dravari Collective, a civilization that had tried to exterminate humanity approximately 140 years ago. They had been larger than humanity at the time, better armed, more organized. He walked the council through the timeline simply and clearly, where the Dravari struck first, how humans responded, what happened over the following decades, how it ended. He moved to the Solhari Empire, then the Mekath Federation, then 4 others, each one a different species, each one a different era, each one the same essential story told with different details. Species that had decided humanity was a problem to be solved through force. Species that had committed their full military and political power to that solution. He used the CI Imperial Archive's own records wherever possible. Sources the council could not call fabricated, because their own historians had written them. He spoke in plain, simple language. He presented the data the same way he had presented the original data chip to Valith. Not as a threat, not as a boast, just as information that existed and could not be argued with. The chamber was absolutely silent. Senna stood near the back wall, translating in a low voice. At some point during the 3rd historical example, her voice had gone slightly unsteady. She kept going. She was a professional. Ethan finished the last example. He turned off the display. He looked at the council. I am not telling you this to frighten anyone, he said. I am not saying the CS Empire would fail if this war continued. I genuinely do not know how it would end. Nobody does. What I know is that every single civilization in that presentation believed they knew how it would end. They were certain, and certainty, in my experience, is the most expensive thing you can be wrong about. He let that sit. The Queen found a legal path that protects this empire and protects my people at the same time, he said. I did not trick her into it. She built it herself and offered it to me. I spent one night finding ways to make it stronger for both sides. That is not manipulation. That is the only thing I know how to do. Try to build something that holds. The silence in the chamber lasted a long time. Then one of the council lords shifted in his seat. He was younger than the others, relatively speaking, with dark chiton and eyes that had been watching Ethan very carefully throughout the entire presentation. He spoke in a low voice to the lord beside him. That lord was quiet for a moment, then nodded once. The head of the council called the revote without announcement or ceremony. He simply said the words and waited. 3 votes to suspend, 4 to proceed. The motion failed. Rhett stood very still on the side of the chamber. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The specific look of a man who has played a strong hand and watched it lose and is already thinking about what comes next. Ethan thanked the council, disconnected his screen from the display port, and walked out of the chamber. In the corridor outside, Senna was waiting for him. She was a small cowlocast, as she described herself, with lighter chitan than most, and eyes that were more green than amber. She had studied humans for most of her adult life. She had read their books and learned their languages, and spent decades trying to understand why they were the way they were. She looked at Ethan for a moment without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "I have translated for many species over many years. I have never translated anything like that before." Ethan looked at her. "Is it accurate, the translation?" "Perfectly accurate," she said. "That is exactly what I mean." He almost smiled. Almost. He put the screen back in his jacket pocket, and they walked together down the long metal corridor toward whatever came next. The imperial capital of Casville was nothing like anything Ethan had ever seen. It was a city built for giants. Everything rose upward. Towers of dark stone that disappeared into low clouds. Bridges wide enough to land ships on. Streets carved from solid rock that rang like metal under every footstep. The planet itself seemed to be made of the same material as the coast. Hard, ancient, and completely unapologetic about what it was. The sky was a deep bruised purple during the day. At night, it turned black so completely that the stars looked closer than they had any right to be. Ethan had been given 3 days to prepare for the ceremony. He spent most of them reading. Senna brought him everything she had on CS royal bond traditions, the rituals, the sequence of events, the things that were considered respectful, and the things that would cause serious problems. He read it all carefully, and asked questions and read it again. He did not ask for changes to any of the traditional elements. He had already made his position clear in the contract amendments inside the ceremony itself. He would follow Kay's custom exactly. That was a choice, not a concession. It mattered to him that they saw it as a choice. There was one part of the ceremony he could not prepare for. Not really. In Cass royal bond tradition, the consort, the one entering the royal family from outside, was required to complete a trial. The trial was called the Varath. It was designed centuries ago to prove that anyone who stood beside the sovereign was worthy of the position. In practice, it meant single combat against a chosen cost warrior selected by the High Council. The warrior the council selected was named Dorith. He was one of the largest CS soldiers Ethan had ever seen, which was saying something. He stood nearly 8 feet tall. His chitin was the deep reddish black of old dried blood. He had served in the imperial military for 30 years, and had never lost a formal combat. He was not selected because the council thought it would be a fair fight. He was selected because the council, most of them anyway, assumed it would be a short one. The morning of the ceremony arrived cold and clear. The sky over Sea Vale was the color of a bruise fading at the edges. The great hall where the Varath would take place was open at the top, a massive circular space with stone walls 50 feet high and an open sky above. Every noble family in the capital had sent representatives. The hall was packed. The sound of thousands of CS gathered in one place was something Ethan felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. A low, constant vibration, like standing next to something very large that was breathing. He entered the circle from the eastern gate. He wore no armor. Cost Customs said the consort could wear whatever they chose for the Vath. Armor, weapons, ceremonial dress. Ethan wore the same jacket he had worn every day since boarding the warship. Dark, plain, slightly worn at the left cuff. He had cleaned it the night before. Dorith entered from the western gate. The crowd's vibration changed when he appeared, got deeper, more focused. The rules of the Varath were simple. The trial ended when one combatant could not continue. There was no time limit. There were no weapons. Just the 2 of them in the circle until one of them stopped. Dorith did not waste time. He crossed the circle in 4 long strides and hit Ethan with enough force to send him sliding 6 feet across the stone floor. The impact was enormous, like being hit by something that did not understand the concept of holding back. He lay still for exactly 1 second. Then he got up. The crowd went quiet. Dorothy hit him again. This time, Ethan went down harder. One knee on the stone, head ringing. He stayed down for 2 seconds this time, breathed, found the floor with his hands. Then he got up again. This was not strategy. It was not cleverness, or legal thinking, or reading old books at night. This was the oldest and simplest thing Ethan Voss knew how to do. He had learned it long before the war, long before the diplomatic corps, long before any of this. He had learned it as a boy and a soldier and a man who had been knocked down by the world more times than he could count, and had developed over the years a very straightforward relationship with the floor. You went down, you got back up. That was the whole of it. Dorothy hit him 7 more times. Each time, Ethan got up. By the 5th time he rose, the crowd had stopped vibrating. The silence in the Snorts Hall was total. The kind of silence that has weight that presses against the ears. By the 7th time, Dorothy had slowed down. Not because he was tired, because something had changed in the dynamic of the circle that the warrior could not quite name. He had fought many opponents. He had put all of them on the ground. None of them had ever looked at him from the floor with the specific expression this human had. Not defiance, not rage, not even determination exactly. Just a kind of steady, quiet patience. Like getting hit was simply something that was happening and would continue to happen. And he had already decided it was not going to be the thing that stopped him. Dorothy raised his hand for the 9th strike. Then he stopped. He lowered his hand. He stepped back 1 pace. It was not submission. It was not defeat in any formal sense. It was the action of a warrior who had encountered something he did not have a category for, and had decided with professional honesty that he was not going to find one today. A crowd erupted. The sound hit the open sky above the hall and kept going. It was not the sound of celebration exactly. It was the sound of something unexpected, something that had no name in their tradition yet, but would have one by tomorrow. Ethan stood in the center of the circle, with blood on his jaw and stone dust on his jacket, and let the sound wash over him. The ceremony that followed was long and complex, and conducted entirely in old-cost formal language that Senna translated quietly into his earpiece throughout. He repeated what he was asked to repeat. He stood where he was directed to stand. He placed his hand against Valus at the moment the ritual required it. Chitin against skin. An odd contrast that the old ceremony had never been written to accommodate and somehow worked anyway. When it was done, they stood together at the edge of the great hall's eastern platform, looking out over the capital city as the purple sky deepened toward evening. The crowd had moved to the celebration spaces below. For a few minutes, it was just the 2 of them and the city and the cooling air. Valith looked out at the skyline. The court is already debating what this means, she said. That's good, Ethan said. Debate means they're thinking about it instead of fighting about it. Then you stood up 9 times. I counted 8, Ethan said. I counted 9. He did not argue. She looked at him then the same way she had looked at him that very first day in the throne hall, when he had slid a data chip across the floor with his boot, and waited in perfect calm to see what she would do, like something she could not entirely understand, and had decided after everything was worth the effort of trying. Why did you agree to this? She asked. The question was quiet, real. You had nothing to gain. Your people will think you gave yourself away. Ethan looked out at the dark stone towers rising against the purple sky. He thought about the corridor, about the faces, about the math that stopped being numbers when you looked at it long enough. 1,000 years from now, he said, I want the history to say that a human and a looked at what they could build and chose that over what they could destroy. That's enough for me. Vale was silent for a long time. The city hummed and glowed below them. Somewhere in the distance, something that might have been music drifted up from the celebration. Ancient and strange and nothing like anything from Earth. You are the strangest creatures in the galaxy, she said at last quietly, almost to herself. Ethan glanced at her. We get that a lot. And for the second time since he had boarded her ship, she laughed.